Okay, this is a book review, and the book is by Robert Harris. It's a trilogy of videos about Cicero. There's 3 books. I previously did a book review about the first 2. The first one was Cicero Imperium. The second one there was Imperium, Lustrum, or it was really Conspirata. And the last one is the one I just did just now called Dictator. Okay, so these are the first 2. And Cicero is like the most important Roman to know about. So then there was Conspirata. And basically the first one was Cicero's rise to power. He was a new man of poor origins, and he became the head of Rome and one of the head consuls. Conspirata was how he dealt with the Catiline conspiracy. And then the last one, Dictator, was all about the civil wars that happened in Rome after the death of Julius Caesar. Well, first of all, there was a civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Julius Caesar won that. Then Julius Caesar was assassinated. Then there was a civil war kind of between Mark Antony and Octavian, but it's more complex than that. They actually later on became allies briefly, Mark Antony and Octavian, and that led to Cicero's downfall. Cicero screwed up. He should have supported Octavian more, who became Augustus. Octavian was the sort of stepson, inheritor of the heir of Julius Caesar after Julius Caesar died. If you want to study Rome, the most important thing you could study is Cicero. Cicero is the person in the middle of everything that's interesting about Rome. He is the transition figure between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Demosthenes was the great Greek speaker, and Cicero was the greatest orator of the Romans. So the first set of characters you had to know were these guys here. This was Pompey, the great general, Julius Caesar, the greatest general ever of ancient Rome. He was the biggest badass you'll ever read about in real life. Marcus Crassus was the real rich guy who wanted to be a general, but he just, he didn't have the mind and the personality for it, and so he got killed by the Parthians. And then Octavian came along. In the will of Julius Caesar, after he was assassinated, he named Octavian to be his heir, and he then became a Caesar, and he also called himself later Augustus. It was sort of declared by the Senate a more high title than Octavian, sort of a plain country guy name. Here's a painting of the triumph of Pompey. Pompey had been a great general, and a big triumph is when you get to march through Rome with all your soldiers, and it's a big holiday fest. So all the generals wanted to someday have a triumph. Well, this is just an earlier thing I showed when Crassus put down a slave revolt, the Spartacus slave revolt, and he crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way. Just a sense of the brutality of Rome. Rome is not like ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is where you learn about, how brilliant the Greeks were and all the wonderful things they did, versus learning about ancient Rome is more like how brutal they were. They were a military powerhouse, and there was a lot of... So here's Julius Caesar. He went into Gaul to pacify the Gauls, and he basically killed like about 1 million of them. He's just brutal. This is Vercingetorix. He was the leader of the Gaul, and, Julius Caesar took him prisoner, later on had him killed, and sort of you could think of Rome as almost being more like the East, more collectivist, more brutal. There's not. If you had to say, what do I like better? I like the ancient Greeks 1,000 times better than the ancient Romans. But what you want to learn about the ancient Romans is it's a power play with nobody has a dog in the fight. You really learn about power politics. Here's when Caesar was crossing the Rubicon. The Senate called him back to Rome, wanted him to come without his legions. He said, screw you. I cannot and will not be without defense. So he wanted all his legions with him. His men were loyal to him, not to the Senate. And so Julius Caesar came back into town. Then that led off a civil war between him and Pompey. Julius Caesar crushed him. Julius Caesar is just a brilliant general. Pompey, by the way, when he was in his 50s, he had like a 19-year-old wife. And, the rich guy has, being that rich made him younger in a sense, okay? Here's Julius Caesar, another painting of him crossing the Rubicon. And Julius Caesar was an amazing guy. You like I said, you won't read about a bigger badass in your life than him. He wanted to be the next Alexander the Great, and he was. Here's Cicero with his supporters. And Cicero was the best orator, the most brilliant man in Rome, but he was also a little bit wimpy and a little bit unrealistic at times, you know. He should have supported Octavian. He screwed up big time by not supporting Octavian. Okay, here's Marcus Porcius, conscience of the Senate. He opposed Julius Caesar to a big degree and later was killed. Here's one of Caesar's speeches in the Senate, like calling out Catiline, who had conspired against him. Here's a better painting of Caesar calling out Catiline, who conspired against him. And notice he's now sitting far from all the senators. This is just a metaphor of what politics is like. You know, you cut off one hydra and then there's a new problem arises pretty soon after that. Julius Caesar got himself into an affair with Cleopatra, and some people were angry about that, figuring he's going to send the resources of Rome to Egypt. And he made a statue of her. And after he had defeated Pompey, it went to his head a little bit. He declared himself to be a god, and that's partly what pissed off the people. He had a conversation with Cicero, and, you know, like you said, he crossed the Rubicon with his troops, but now Cicero had some conversation about him, religious, theological, philosophical, and actually Cicero lowered his guard after that conversation and didn't necessarily have a bunch of bodyguards with him at all times, but he should have. He should have been more paranoid, because the Romans did not like a king, and they saw him as becoming like a king, a dictator. Here's some from a movie with Liz Taylor, and Rex Harrison would be the old Caesar, and the young guys like Mark Antony, who later on also had an affair with Cleopatra. She was a foxy babe. I'll bet you she looked a lot more like Elizabeth Taylor than the lady in this picture. Here's Mark Antony meeting with Cleopatra. So she was femme fatale. Later on, Octavian fought with Caesar, and Antony fought with Octavian, and he lost the Battle of Actium, and Cleopatra sort of turned and fled on him, you know. And sadly, that's not that uncommon a thing, that a woman abandons the man when he's in his most desperate low point. She's like, oh, I don't need this BS, you know. Like Chris Rock had a comedy routine. He says, you know, the woman loses her job, the husband says, oh, it's no big deal, we'll be okay, we'll be fine, I'll support you, we're going to make it. Whereas the man loses his job, the woman says, bye-bye. That happens more often than people realize. Okay, here's Octavian, later became Augustus Caesar, and he was the transition. You know, Cicero and him transitioned between the Roman Republic, which is like the high point of Rome, to the Roman Empire. And he sort of gave the Senate the titles of power, but he himself kept the real power to himself. Okay, constant practice, devoted oneself. These are a couple Cicero quotes. Okay, so Cicero, he was good. He was real good. You know, Cicero was a hero, but Cicero also was a little bit naive. Again, if you only study one Roman, you want to study Cicero. Okay, some of the stuff I already talked about before, so I'm not going to go it again in my earlier book reports. I put them all together, but now I'll talk about the things that I would talk about. You know, he got himself in trouble with Clodius, and so Cicero would sometimes make himself enemies unnecessarily. And partly it's because he had good ethics. He was sort of the proto-Christian. You know, he was a Platonist. And, you know, like Nietzsche had said, Platonism is, Christianity is Platonism for the masses. There's a lot of overlap, and it really goes with Greek philosophy. So Cicero just wouldn't go along as easily as they always wanted. For example, he wouldn't join the triumvirate between Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Crassus, and they actually accused him, perhaps rightfully so, of undermining their triumvirate. Then when Crassus got killed by the Parthians, that destabilized things, because now instead of having three of them, it was just Pompey and Caesar, and then there was a little bit of a power back and forth between Pompey and Caesar, and when it came to civil war, Julius Caesar just kicked the crap out of him. He was a better general. You know, the Robert Harris is a great writer, and there were a lot of enjoyable little lines, like Cicero would go off on a tirade in his speeches, and his speeches were like an actor's performance, very dramatic. He really emphasized stirring up emotions. He used strings of rhetorical questions to get the emotion of the audience on his side. And Cicero, as a turning point in Rome, kind of reminds me of like what Pericles and Plato were to Athens, you know, a turning point for Athens. Cicero really screwed up big time when he made a joke about Octavian. He said something along the lines when asked about what did he plan for Octavian. He said, he shall be praised and raised and then erased. You know, so as if he wanted to stir up support for Octavian to get him to bump off Mark Antony, and then afterwards they were going to sort of push Octavian aside. Cicero underestimated him because he's only like 18, 19 years old. Okay. that was a big mistake, because afterwards, when Octavian felt that he wasn't getting enough support from Cicero, he just joined forces with Mark Antony. And now Mark Antony had Octavian on his side, which meant that Cicero was no longer protected. So then Mark Antony had Cicero executed. Just typical good quotes of Cicero. Let us draw strength from the heroism of our ancestors. A speech is a performance. It is not a philosophical discourse. The most important thing is to stir up the emotions, to move the crowd. Brutus made a speech. He said, just as my ancestors helped rid Rome of the tyrant Tarquin, I have helped rid Rome of the tyrant Julius Caesar. Okay? And after Cassius and Brutus and the others had slain Julius Caesar, they really didn't plan well for the aftermath. And Mark Antony rose to power, and he ended up, killing Cicero, which was kind of sad. Okay, well, I think that's all I got for Numero. I can tell you it was a great series of books. I really enjoyed it. I listened to the audiobooks in the car. So the viewer who told me about that, thank you very much. It was well worthwhile. So if you want to entertain yourself with Roman history, I think this is a great place to go. If you want to learn more Roman history, I would say just getting started. The Rufus Fears Famous Romans is probably the best DVD course. And then there's other good stuff, but those are the two great things. And I would read Edith Hamilton on the Romans. Those are the three best info sources on the Romans. I got, that Gregory Aldrete is a great historian on the Romans too. I like him. And his lecture on the oratory of Cicero is great. I read, a book about Quintilian. That was good. The guy who had the orator school. So anyways, I hope that's helpful.